Chinese destroyer surged forward, cutting across the waves like a predator on the hunt. Overhead, dozens of J-15 fighters thundered across the sky, their engines ripping through the humid tropical air. Beneath the surface, a Chinese submarine glided silently, its presence almost ghost-like, stalking unseen. Beijing's intentions were unmistakable. This was not a routine patrol. It was an orchestrated show of force, meant to corner, intimidate, and humiliate the United States Navy in the South China Sea. But what the Chinese commanders did not realize was that they were walking straight into a carefully laid trap, one set by an invisible predator lurking beneath the waves. This confrontation would soon turn from calculated provocation into a costly lesson about the meaning of true power. The stage was set on August 14, 2025, in the South China Sea, one of the world's most volatile flashpoints. The stakes were enormous. Every year, roughly $3.4 trillion worth of global trade flowed through these waters, making them the beating heart of international commerce. Beneath the seabed lay untapped riches in oil and natural gas, resources that promised energy security and geopolitical leverage to whoever controlled them. For Beijing, the South China Sea symbolized far more than trade routes. It represented national pride, power projection, and the long-promised rejuvenation of China as a global superpower. Through artificial islands bristling with radar stations and missile batteries, China had redrawn the map, turning the controversial nine-dash line from fiction into near reality. To Beijing, U.S. patrols were not harmless exercises in navigation. They were intrusions into what China now regarded as its backyard. For Washington, the stakes were just as high. America had long acted as the guarantor of maritime freedom and regional stability. If China succeeded in asserting full control over the South China Sea, U.S. influence in Asia would wither, and allies like Taiwan, the Philippines, and Vietnam would find themselves increasingly vulnerable to Chinese pressure. Every U.S. freedom of navigation operation was therefore more than a naval maneuver. It was a declaration. America would not yield, and international waters would remain free. It was in this high-pressure environment that the guided missile cruiser USS Princeton found itself face-to-face with China's Type 52D destroyer. For the crew of the Princeton, the morning had begun routinely. The bridge buzzed with the quiet hum of electronics, officers exchanging low-voiced reports, while the ship's air conditioning struggled against the oppressive tropical heat. Most days, these patrols were 99% monotony and 1% sheer terror. Today, that 1% was about to arrive. The confrontation began not with a missile launch, but with a blip on the radar. Contact, bearing 85, range 20 nautical miles, a young officer reported, eyes fixed on his console. Designated Sierra 1, looks like a Liang III-class destroyer. At first, the contact seemed routine, another shadow in the chess game of constant patrols, but within minutes, that shadow lunged forward. The Chinese destroyer suddenly surged from 18 knots to 30 in less than 90 seconds. On the Princeton's tactical display, its vector shifted, the red line of its course pointing directly at them. "Captain," the officer warned, his voice tight now, "Sierra 1 is on an intercept course. CPA 0. Collision in 12 minutes at current speed." The air on the bridge grew heavier. The trap was sprung. This was no ordinary course correction. It was a brazen turn, deliberate and precise, executed with the sole purpose of cutting directly across the bow of the USS Princeton. In naval terms, such an action is one of the most reckless and dangerous maneuvers possible, risking a catastrophic collision at sea. But this was no mistake. The Chinese destroyer's sharp turn was no impulsive gamble by an overzealous captain. It was a calculated order issued from Beijing itself. The move had layers of intent. At its core, it was a test of nerves, designed to intimidate the American crew and force them into a humiliating retreat. If the Princeton altered course, Beijing would seize the moment as proof of American weakness, broadcasting it as a symbolic victory. If the Princeton held steady, the risk of collision and the potential for the clash to spiral into a full-blown military crisis would skyrocket. Either way, China sought to impose its will, to demonstrate that the South China Sea was its domain, and that U.S. warships no longer had free rein in waters Beijing increasingly claimed as its own. Beyond the tactical standoff, the goal was to humiliate Washington on the world stage, sending the unmistakable message that the balance of power was shifting and that the era of uncontested American dominance was coming to an end. In an instant, a routine patrol had been transformed into a high-stakes standoff between two nuclear-armed powers, drawing them dangerously close to a conflict neither side truly wanted. Inside the Princeton's Combat Information Center, the CIC, the ship's nerve center, the atmosphere shifted from routine to electric. The Aegis combat system, the beating heart of the cruiser's defenses, tracked the Chinese vessel's sudden acceleration and flagged it as an immediate threat. Within 3 minutes, projections showed the Princeton would soon enter the destroyer's effective strike envelope. Yet no one panicked, no hasty buttons were pressed, no retaliatory fire was ordered. Instead, the ship's captain issued a calm, steady command that cut through the tension like a blade. Maintain course and speed, watch and wait. The vertical launch system cells, packed with dozens of deadly surface-to-air and anti-ship missiles, remained sealed and cold. The Harpoon launchers, each missile armed with a 500-pound warhead capable of gutting a modern warship, stayed silent. This was not hesitation. It was restraint rooted in supreme confidence. The captain knew the trap Beijing was laying. An American overreaction, one missile, one torpedo, one trigger pulled in panic, would hand China a propaganda victory regardless of the outcome. But patience was the greater weapon. The Princeton and its crew knew they were shielded by the most advanced naval air defense system in the world. More importantly, they were not alone. Looming behind them in the formation was the pride of the U.S. Navy, the USS Gerald R. Ford. On her massive deck, squadrons of FA-18EF Super Hornets stood ready, their engines only moments away from roaring to life. Beyond the horizon, orbiting high above, early warning aircraft scanned the skies. And still farther away, across the Pacific, waited the full industrial, economic, and military might of the United States. The message to Beijing was unmistakable. America could afford patience because America held the winning hand. To project calm in the face of provocation was, in itself, the ultimate display of power. But Beijing was not prepared to let the gambit end so easily. Having failed to rattle the Americans with a surface confrontation, Chinese commanders escalated. At 25,000 feet, an American E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft relayed new intelligence. Dozens of J-15 Flying Shark fighters were lifting off from the deck of China's aircraft carrier Shandong. One by one, they rose into the sky, a clear signal that Beijing was ready to widen the confrontation from a tense naval duel into a multi-domain standoff. Almost simultaneously, alarms sounded in the Princeton's sonar room. A technician, brow furrowed, lifted his headset and spoke with deliberate clarity. Con sonar, new contact, designated Victor 1, sounds like a Type 39 diesel electric. Very noisy, sir. I can hear her machinery from 10 miles out. The report drew grim nods. The Type 39 was no cutting-edge threat. Built in the 1980s, the vessel was clumsy compared to America's sleek Virginia-class submarines. Its acoustic profile was so loud that U.S. operators often joked it was like a freight train rumbling through a crowded station. But the point was not stealth, it was pressure. Beijing had now introduced a submarine threat into the mix, surrounding the U.S. strike group with surface, air, and undersea forces in a three-pronged pincer. It was escalation, plain and simple. The American response was as swift as it was overwhelming. At precisely 9:37 a.m., the electromagnetic catapults aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford whined to life. On the flight deck, a disciplined chaos unfolded as deck crews in color-coded jerseys swarmed into motion. Yellow shirts guided jets into position, green shirts operated the catapults, and red shirts handled the weapons. With a thunderous roar, the first FA-18EF Super Hornet rocketed off the deck, accelerating from 0 to 150 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. It was followed by another, then another, until the carrier's air wing began filling the sky. Moments later, EA-18G Growlers, electronic warfare aircraft, joined the formation. The Growlers immediately unleashed their power. Their advanced jamming pods lit up, sending out a storm of signals that turned Chinese radar screens into blizzards of false echoes. To radar operators aboard the Shandong and the destroyer shadowing the Princeton, the tactical picture dissolved into chaos. Ghost contacts appeared and disappeared at random. Genuine aircraft blended seamlessly into a haze of fabricated returns. It was as though the skis themselves had fractured into an illusion. The balance had shifted. China had escalated, but America had answered in kind, demonstrating not only its firepower, but its mastery of the invisible domains of electronic warfare and patience under pressure. The standoff was no longer about who would blink first. It was about who truly understood the meaning of power in the 21st century. A dozen American fighters could look like 100 or vanish entirely, thanks to advanced jamming and electronic warfare. On enemy radar screens, false echoes appeared miles away from their true positions, a dazzling demonstration of American mastery of the electromagnetic battlefield. At 9:47 a.m., the confrontation escalated dangerously. In a move usually reserved for the seconds before a missile launch, the Chinese destroyer locked its fire control radar onto the USS Gerald R. Ford itself. It was the most provocative signal yet, but even then the Americans held their nerve. Missile tubes stayed sealed. The command remained measured and calm, hold position, maintain discipline, and show no weakness. In the air, a Chinese J-15 fighter skimmed dangerously close to a U.S. jet, probing for a reaction. But the American pilot, trained for precisely this kind of intimidation, refused the bait. He held steady, unshaken. Meanwhile, the flight deck of the Ford thundered to life. Catapult after catapult fired in relentless rhythm. 30,000-pound Super Hornets leapt into the sky with each launch, first a dozen, then 20, then 30. The tempo never faltered. Within minutes, nearly 50 Super Hornets and EA-18G Growlers had formed a wall of steel and firepower in the sky. This was more than air superiority. It was a breathtaking demonstration of the U.S. Navy's ability to project massive combat power from the sea at will. Yet the true masterstroke of American power projection had not yet been revealed. Just as tensions reached their zenith, the sea itself betrayed China's overconfidence. Without warning, a massive dark shape broke the surface only 6 miles from the Chinese carrier Shandong. A violent patch of white water frothed, then gave way to the black, angular sail of a Virginia-class attack submarine. Water streamed from its hull as it rose with quiet menace. Its location was a revelation and a humiliation. To surface undetected within point-blank range of China's most prized asset was to send an unmistakable message. We were here all along. We can strike when we choose, and you never saw us coming. The implications were devastating. At that range, the submarine's Mk-48 heavyweight torpedoes could not miss. Each warhead carried enough power to snap the keel of even the largest aircraft carrier, sending it to the bottom in minutes. Escape was impossible. For the Chinese admiral aboard the Shandong, watching through binoculars, the realization must have frozen the blood in his veins. His carrier, his entire fleet, was trapped in the crosshairs of an invisible predator. The bravado that had driven Beijing's gambit collapsed instantly. The destroyer still advanced, the J-15s still circled, but the dynamic had shifted beyond repair. The wall of American aircraft above and the lethal submarine below had shredded China's strategy. At 4:23 p.m., the order came from Beijing. The exercise is over. The Type 52D destroyer slowed. The diesel-electric submarine slipped away. The Shandong and its fighters turned back toward home. What began as a display of strength ended in quiet withdrawal. No shots had been fired, but the message was deafening. The South China Sea did not belong to China alone. Any attempt to challenge that reality would end not in triumph, but in embarrassment. The United States had proven that true power lies not in reckless escalation, but in calculated restraint backed by overwhelming capability. On that day, the South China Sea did not feel like disputed waters. To the crew of the Gerald R. Ford strike group, it felt almost like America's sixth Great Lake, only saltier.